Something is very wrong in this case, and the deeper you look, the uglier it gets. Actor Timothy Busfield walked out of a New Mexico jail after a week in custody, but instead of clarity, the courtroom erupted into a storm of accusations, counterattacks, and a defense strategy so aggressive it left the entire gallery stunned. In a move that blindsided everyone, Busfield's lawyers didn't just deny the allegations, they turned the spotlight on the child's parents, painting them as opportunistic, manipulative, and hiding secrets of their own. Suddenly, the narrative twisted, motives were questioned, histories were dragged out, and a case that should have been straightforward has mutated into a labyrinth of contradictions, power plays, and unanswered questions. Tonight, we're pulling apart every thread, because if even half of what's being suggested is true, this isn't just a legal battle, it's a war over truth itself. Listen carefully, because what you think you know about this case may not match what the documents, the recordings, and the courtroom moves are quietly revealing. In late 2024, a familiar Hollywood name suddenly appeared in headlines for a reason no one expected, and within hours, the internet had already decided the outcome. But court records, law enforcement actions, and conflicting statements began to paint a far more complicated sequence of events, one where timelines don't perfectly line up, where audio evidence clashes with later claims, and where the defense is no longer just defending, but pointing fingers back at the people who filed the complaint. And before we go any further, if you care about serious investigative breakdowns like this, hit subscribe now, because cases like this are never as simple as the headlines make them look. According to law enforcement reports, actor Timothy Busfield was taken into custody in Albuquerque, New Mexico, following allegations involving child sexual abuse, allegations that immediately triggered national attention. Within hours, social media platforms exploded with commentary, speculation, and conclusions. But the legal system moved at its own pace. After approximately a week in custody, a judge ordered Busfield's release, a decision that confused many people who were only following the headlines and not the filings. That release did not end the case. Instead, it marked the beginning of a much more aggressive legal battle that is still unfolding in public view. One of the most contested pieces of this case centers on a police interview recording that surfaced early in the investigation. According to reports, that audio contains statements that investigators initially described as consistent with the original allegations, but later the narrative began to shift. Defense attorneys challenged the interpretation of that recording, arguing that the context was misunderstood, that the questions were leading, and that the conclusions drawn from the audio were being stretched far beyond what was actually said. This is where the timeline begins to fracture, because while early summaries framed the interview one way, later court filings suggested a different reading entirely. At the same time, online discussions intensified. A Reddit thread that gained massive traction introduced new speculation, with users dissecting every available document, every public statement, and even the timing of social media deletions by people connected to the situation. When actress Melissa Gilbert reportedly removed her Instagram account, many interpreted it as a sign of internal panic or distancing, even though no official statement confirmed that interpretation. But perception matters, and once a narrative takes hold, it rarely waits for confirmation. Then came the moment that changed how the case was being talked about. In a move that stunned observers, Busfield's legal team shifted strategies. Instead of only disputing the allegations, they openly questioned the motivations of the parents who filed the complaint. In court, the defense reportedly described them as ambitious and suggested that their actions were not purely about justice, but about retaliation. This claim, still unproven, injected a new layer of controversy into the proceedings. Suddenly, the conversation was no longer just about what may or may not have happened years ago, but about why the complaint was being brought now and under what circumstances. This is where things become legally complex and emotionally explosive, because retaliation defenses are rare, risky, and difficult to prove. But when they appear, they do so for a reason. The defense implied that previous disputes, personal conflicts, and financial tensions may have played a role in the accusations. The prosecution, however, continues to stand by the original timeline, maintaining that the complaint emerged only after the alleged victim felt safe enough to speak. These two explanations cannot both be true in the same way, and that is exactly why this case has captured so much attention. And here is where the audio recording re-enters the picture. Legal experts analyzing the situation note that recorded interviews often sound different to different ears. What sounds like an admission to one person may sound like confusion or misinterpretation to another. Defense filings reportedly point out inconsistencies between the audio and the later summaries of the interview, raising questions about how early assumptions may have influenced later conclusions. Meanwhile, prosecutors argue that the overall pattern of statements support their position, even if individual moments are disputed. Public reaction has been fierce and divided. Some believe the release from custody suggests weakness in the case. Others argue it's a standard procedural step that says nothing about guilt or innocence. Social media continues to move faster than the courts, and in that speed, nuance is often lost. That's why this channel exists. To slow things down, to look at documents instead of hashtags, and to understand how real investigations actually unfold in real time. What makes the situation even more unsettling is the way the narrative keeps changing depending on who is speaking. Police statements, court filings, defense arguments, and online commentary all tell slightly different versions of the same events. That doesn't mean someone is lying. It means the truth may be buried in details that only a full trial can uncover. And that trial, if it moves forward, will force every claim, every recording, and every accusation to be examined under oath. As of now, the case remains unresolved. No verdict has been reached, no final judgment has been made. And yet, reputations have already been altered, relationships severed, and careers paused. This is the part of the process the public rarely sees, the long, quiet, grinding middle, where evidence is tested, not tweeted, and where the outcome is still uncertain. So before you decide what you believe, ask yourself this. How many times have you seen a headline, formed an opinion, and never revisited the case when the facts became complicated? Because this is one of those moments where patience matters, where restraint matters, and where the truth, whatever it turns out to be, will only emerge if the process is allowed to finish. If you want updates as new filings drop, if you want calm analysis instead of noise, and if you want to understand how real investigations actually work, subscribe now and turn on notifications. This case is far from over, and when the next piece of evidence surfaces, you'll want to hear it explained, not screamed. And now the sequence continues, because this is the point where many people stop paying attention, and that silence is exactly what allows confusion to replace facts. After the release order was issued, something subtle but important happened. The conversation changed. News coverage slowed, social media moved on, and yet the legal machinery did not stop. Motions were filed, responses were drafted, arguments were sharpened. This is the phase of a case that rarely goes viral, but it's the phase where outcomes are shaped. And if you only follow the noise, you miss the truth forming quietly on paper. Court records show that the defense began pressing harder on inconsistencies they say exist between the earliest reports and later statements. They pointed to timelines that didn't align perfectly, to descriptions that evolved, and to recollections that appeared more detailed with time. Prosecutors responded by emphasizing something equally important, that delayed clarity is common in cases involving alleged abuse, especially when the complainant is a minor. Two interpretations, both legally recognized, now stand face to face. And this is where the public often gets uncomfortable, because uncertainty feels like weakness, even when it is actually the process working exactly as designed. Meanwhile, the defense's police interview audio continued to circulate, in fragments, never in full context, never with the full transcript, and never with the explanatory framework that investigators rely on. Defense filings reportedly argued that the tone, pauses, and phrasing were being interpreted through a lens already shaped by suspicion. The prosecution maintained that the audio was one part of a larger pattern. And this is the trap people fall into, believing one piece of evidence should carry the entire weight of a case, when in reality, no single piece ever does. Online, the pressure never stopped. Comment sections filled with certainty, even as the courts were still asking questions. People demanded immediate answers, immediate accountability, immediate resolution. But justice doesn't work on demand. It works on evidence, and evidence takes time. That time feels unbearable when emotions are involved, but skipping it only creates more damage. This is where guilt sets in, not for one person, but for everyone watching and forgetting. Forgetting that real people are on both sides of this. Forgetting that allegations are not verdicts. Forgetting that restraint is not silence, it is responsibility. Then came the defense's most controversial move yet, the suggestion of retaliation, not as a slogan, not as a headline, but as a legal argument that required them to expose personal background details of the parents. This instantly split public opinion. Some saw it as a necessary defense in a high-stakes case. Others saw it as an aggressive tactic meant to distract. The court allowed the argument to be heard, not because it was proven, but because the law requires all plausible defenses to be examined, and that alone tells you how serious this has become. At the same time, silence from certain public figures was interpreted as meaning. Social media accounts disappearing became symbols, even though no one confirmed why. And this is where the guilt belongs, with all of us who read into silence, who fill in gaps with assumptions, who decide outcomes before evidence is tested. Because once the narrative is locked in online, it is almost impossible to undo, even if the facts later demand it. As of now, there is no final ruling. No jury has spoken, no judge has issued a conclusion on the merits. What exists instead is a complex, uncomfortable space where accusations, defenses, recordings, and motivations are all under scrutiny at the same time. This is not entertainment. This is a legal process unfolding in real time, and it deserves more attention than outrage ever could. And if you've made it this far, you're already doing something most people won't. Staying, listening, waiting for evidence instead of noise. That's why this channel matters. That's why you should subscribe. Because when the next filing drops, when the next court decision lands, when the next claim is tested against reality, we will be here to explain it carefully, calmly, and responsibly, not to tell you what to think, but to give you the information to decide for yourself. So don't look away now. Don't let the quiet part fool you. This case isn't over, and neither is the responsibility of paying attention. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and stay with us, because the truth never arrives in a rush. It arrives when people are still watching.